My name is Sera Okonkwo. I am 31 years old. And the afternoon of my nephew Tobias's christening reception was when I finally understood that the most complete form of proof is the kind that exists before anyone asks for it. The reception was held at a place called the Harrow House, a converted 19th century mill building about 12 minutes from my brother's home in the east part of the city. It had exposed stone walls, wide plank floors, tall windows that let in the afternoon light in long, flat panels, and a catering kitchen that the venue's coordinator, a woman named Paulette Shire, had described to me in our first planning call as flexible but precise, which turned out to be an accurate description both of the kitchen and of Paulette herself. The venue held 80 comfortably. We had 52 guests. The tables were set with white linen and small arrangements of cream-colored flowers that my sister-in-law Adiz had chosen from a photograph on Paulette's website, and there was a tiered cake near the window that Adiz's mother had baked and driven 3 hours to deliver that morning. It was a Saturday in late September. Tobias was 3 months old. The ceremony at the church had taken 41 minutes and had been led by a priest named Father Mensa, who had known my brother Daniel since Daniel was in secondary school, and who had the quality of warmth that some clergy have of making a room feel smaller and more held than it actually is. Tobias had slept through most of it, which everyone agreed was either a sign of deep peace or a sign that he had been up since 4 in the morning, and both of these things were probably true. I had driven to the Harrow House directly from the church, arriving 8 minutes before the guests, to confirm the room setup with Paulette. She was already at the entrance with a clipboard. We walked the room together in 4 minutes. Everything was correct. I thanked her and went to find my seat. My seat was at the family table near the front of the room. My father, Emeka Okonkwo, was already seated when I arrived, with a glass of wine that was his second of the afternoon. I had seen him accept the first one at the church social hour immediately after the ceremony. He was 63 years old, broad-shouldered, with the bearing of a man who had spent 40 years being the largest presence in any room he entered. He had built a small construction business in his 50s after first career in civil engineering, and the business had been, for about 6 years, a modest and legitimate success. Then, 3 years before the christening, a combination of factors I will account for in a moment had caused the business to contract sharply, and the contraction had not improved his disposition toward people he considered to have made easier choices than he had. He looked at me when I sat down. He said, "You look tired." I said I had been up early helping Adiz's mother with the cake delivery logistics. He nodded once and looked back at his wine. That was the temperature of our relationship in that period, not hostile in any explicit way, but operating at a baseline assumption on his part that I was a person who required managing, who had not figured out the fundamentals, who was, in his private accounting, a version of his children that had not gone according to plan. My brother Daniel had gone according to plan. Engineering degree, stable job, house, wife, child. I had gone a different direction, and my father had never fully developed a framework for the direction I had gone, which meant he applied the framework he had, which was the one that fit Daniel, and I consistently failed to fit it. What none of the 52 people in that room knew, what my father specifically did not know, was that the room they were sitting in, the food they were eating, and the flowers on the tables had been paid for, in full, by me. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me account for the direction I had gone, and for the specific arithmetic that made that Saturday afternoon possible. I had left home at 20 to take a place at a design school in a city 4 hours north of where my family lived. My father had not supported this. His position, stated clearly when I was accepted, was that design was not a profession but a hobby with pretensions, and that if I was serious about a career I would study something with infrastructure, his word which he used often and which meant, in his usage, a field with established hiring pipelines, professional licensing, and a clear relationship between credential and income. Engineering, medicine, law. He had built his first career in civil engineering, and he understood, in a structural sense, how a life was supposed to be assembled. I went to design school anyway. I paid for it with a combination of a merit scholarship that covered 60% of my tuition, a part-time job at a print shop that covered my rent and utilities, and a government education loan that I had been repaying in fixed monthly installments since the month after I graduated, 5 years before the christening. My father's characterization of this arrangement, when he discussed it with family members, was that I had gone off to study art on borrowed money, and that someone would eventually have to sort out the consequences. He said this without apparent awareness that I was sorting out the consequences myself, in the form of the monthly installment, and that the borrowed money had been borrowed from a government program available to all students, not from anyone in the family. After design school, I had spent 2 years at a mid-sized branding agency, learning the client-facing side of the work I had studied, and then 3 years building a freelance practice with enough clients that the freelance income had exceeded my agency salary by the end of the 2nd year of independent work. At the time of the christening, I was running a small studio, 5 people, myself included, in a rented office space on the 4th floor of a building in the design district, with annual revenue that I will not state precisely, because the precise figure is not the point, but which was, in the relevant year, sufficient to pay the Harrow House deposit of $6,200 without discussion with anyone, and without adjusting any other aspect of my budget. Daniel had mentioned, about 2 months before the christening, that he and Adiz were thinking about a reception but were uncertain about the cost. He said it in the way he sometimes said things, generally, toward the air between us. And I asked him what kind of venue he had in mind and how many guests they were expecting. He described something modest. I said I would look into some options. He said that would be great, and we talked about something else. I called Paulette Shire at the Harrow House the following week. I visited the venue, confirmed the availability, reviewed the catering packages, and put the deposit on my credit card. I told Paulette that the event was a family christening reception and that the billing contact was me and that I preferred to handle the financial arrangements directly. She noted this in the file, without comment. I told Daniel I had found a venue and that it was handled. He asked what he owed me. I said nothing, it was a gift. He was quiet for a moment and then said thank you in a way that suggested he understood both the gift and the instruction not to make it into a bigger conversation than it needed to be. I did not tell my father. I did not tell my Aunt Blessing, who was my father's younger sister and who shared his general framework for assessing my life choices. I did not tell anyone except Daniel, and Daniel had understood that the information was not for circulation. The reason I did not tell my father was not strategic. It was simpler than that. I had spent years watching my father respond to information about my professional life with a particular sequence. Skepticism stated as concern, concern stated as warning, warning stated as prediction of failure. I had learned that offering him information he could reframe as evidence of my limitations was not useful to either of us. The receipt at the Harrow House was mine. It did not need to be part of a conversation about whether I was capable. The toasts began at 2:45. Daniel spoke first, warm, a little nervous, the speech of a person who has written something down and is reading approximately half of it and remembering the other half. Adiz's father spoke next, in a mixture of English and Igbo that required the room to lean in slightly and that produced, in the leaning, a kind of collective attention that made what he said land more fully than it might have otherwise. Adiz's mother declined to speak, but accepted the room's applause when Daniel gestured toward her and the cake. Then my father stood up. He had a fresh glass of wine, his third, by my count, though I was not certain of this, and I note it not to characterize him as a person who drinks excessively, but because it is part of the accurate account of the afternoon. He had the glass raised slightly before he began speaking, the gesture of a toast already in progress. He said he was grateful to be there. He said Tobias was a blessing. He said that watching Daniel build a family made him proud in the way that only a father of a son could fully understand. Then he looked across the table at me. He said that families were complicated, and that not all of his children had found their footing in the same way or at the same speed. He said this with the particular tone of a man who believes he is being generous by not being more specific. He said that some people took longer to understand what responsibility looked like. He said that he hoped, watching Tobias grow up, that certain members of the family would come to understand that a life built on handouts and excuses was not a life you could be proud of. He said, she spent her adult life surviving on handouts and excuses. He said my name before he said it. 52 guests. My Aunt Blessing, seated 2 chairs down from me, made a sound. Not quite a laugh, more the releasing of a breath through a smile, the sound of a person who has heard a version of this before and finds it confirms something they already believed. I reached for my water glass. I wrapped both hands around it. It was cold, and the cold was useful, and I lifted it and took a sip and set it back on the linen without a sound. I did not look at my father. I did not look at my aunt. I looked at the cream-colored flower arrangement at the center of the table, and I counted the stems. 9 stems. A number I have not forgotten.
My father was still speaking.
He said something about hoping the next generation would do better. He said something about Tobias inheriting the right values.
He sat down.
What none of the 52 people in that room had observed, because she moved with the professional efficiency of a person who has learned to be present without being visible, was that Paulette Shire had entered the room from the catering corridor during my father's toast and had positioned herself near the side table where the cake was displayed, clipboard in hand, running a standard mid-event check on the service flow. She had heard the toast from 6 feet away. Paulette Shire was 50 years old, had managed events at the Harrow House for 14 years, and had in that time developed the specific quality of a person who has witnessed a very wide range of human behavior at family gatherings and who responds to it with a calm that comes from extensive prior exposure. She did not intervene immediately. She completed her notes on the clipboard. She spoke briefly with one of the servers. Then she crossed the room to the family table with the measured pace of a person who is doing the next item on her list. She stopped at my father's end of the table. "Excuse me," she said. "I want to confirm a detail for our post-event file." She looked at my father directly. Her voice was even and professional and carried precisely to the table without projecting beyond it. "Could you confirm the name of the person who holds the contract for this event?" My father looked at her. He said he wasn't sure what she meant. She said, "The contract, the deposit, the catering agreement, the venue arrangement, the person of record." She waited. My father looked at Daniel. Daniel was very still, his water glass in both hands, not moving. My father looked back at Paulette. He said he assumed the family had arranged it. Paulette said, "The contract is in the name of Sera Okonkwo." The deposit of $6,200 was paid by Sera Okonkwo. The catering package was selected and confirmed by Sera Okonkwo. All communications regarding this event have been with Sera Okonkwo. She paused. "I wanted to make sure you had the accurate information, in case it was useful." She wrote something on her clipboard. She said she hoped everyone was enjoying the afternoon. She walked back toward the catering corridor. 52 people were in that room. Approximately 30 of them had a direct line of sight to the family table. I want to be precise about what happened in the room after Paulette Shire walked away, because precision matters here. My Aunt Blessing put her wine glass down on the table. She did not set it down. She put it down, which is a different gesture, the gesture of a person reassessing the weight of something they are holding. My father sat with his back straight and his hands on the table in front of him, and he looked at the center of the table.
Not at me.
Not at Paulette's retreating back. At the center of the table, where the cream-colored flowers were arranged in a vase that I had paid for along with everything else. Daniel looked at me from across the table. His expression was the expression of a person who has just watched something he had been carrying privately become public in a way he had not anticipated, but cannot say he regrets. Adiz, beside him, touched his arm. Father Mensah, who had been seated at the adjacent table and who had the quality of attention that comes from decades of pastoral work, looked briefly at the family table and then looked away in a movement so deliberate it constituted a form of grace, the decision not to witness what was not his to witness. I ate the rest of my meal. I spoke with Adiz's cousin, who was visiting from abroad and who wanted to know about the design district and whether the city had good architecture worth looking at, and I told her about 3 buildings she should find time to see. I held Tobias twice during the reception, once at the request of Adiz's mother, who needed both hands free for the cake cutting, and once because he was near me and awake and seemed, in the particular alert way of a 3-month-old, to be interested in the window light, which I understood. My father did not speak to me for the remainder of the reception. He spoke to Daniel. He spoke to Father Mensah. He accepted cake when it was served. He left at 4:15 with my Aunt Blessing, who did not look at me on the way out but whose posture, as she walked past my chair, was different from the posture she had arrived with. I want to account for the days and weeks after the christening because what followed was not simple, and I think simplifying it would be a form of inaccuracy. My father called me 11 days later. It was a Sunday morning, which was when he called because Sunday mornings had always been his time for calls he needed to make but was not sure how to start. He called at 9:42. I let it ring twice before I answered. He said he had heard from Daniel about the arrangements for the reception. He said he had not known. I told him I had not mentioned it. He said, "Why didn't you mention it?" I said, "I didn't think it would change anything." He was quiet for a moment that lasted longer than most silences in our conversations. Then he said, "It should have." We talked for 37 minutes. The conversation did not resolve anything completely, because 37 minutes is not enough time to address the accumulation of a decade of a particular kind of seeing and not seeing. What it did was open something that had been closed, which is a more modest outcome, and also, I think, the accurate one. My Aunt Blessing called me 6 days after my father did. Her call was shorter, 17 minutes. She said she owed me an apology, which she delivered without elaboration. I accepted it without elaboration. We talked for the remaining time about Tobias, and about whether his eyes were going to stay the shade they were. Both of us knew that the elaboration was not the point. The situation with my father's business, which I mentioned earlier and which I said I would account for, the construction business had contracted because of a combination of a difficult project that had run significantly over budget, a key subcontractor relationship that had ended badly, and a period of 2 years in which my father had been managing health issues that had affected his capacity to manage the business at full attention. By the time of the christening, the business was operating at roughly a third of its peak capacity, and my father had been, for about 8 months, in conversations with a small number of contacts about what came next. One of those conversations, which I did not initiate but did not discourage when my brother mentioned that it might be worth having, was with my studio. My studio does brand and identity work, visual systems, communications frameworks, the design infrastructure that businesses use to present themselves in the market. My father's construction business needed this, in particular because one of the directions he was considering for the business's next chapter involved repositioning toward a slightly different market segment, which required updated materials and a cleaner visual identity. The conversation Daniel had suggested took place 4 months after the christening. My operations director, a careful and precise person named Oluwatosin Bello, ran the meeting. I attended the second half. We took the project. It was a mid-scale engagement structured over 6 months, with clear deliverables and a payment schedule. My father paid the invoices on time. The work was good. He used the new materials. The business, in the 18 months since the project concluded, has recovered to approximately its prior capacity, and there are indicators that the repositioning has opened a market segment that the prior identity was not reaching. He does not work for my company. The title of this story uses a formulation I chose because it captures the arc of the relationship more precisely than the literal facts would suggest. What is true is that for 6 months, my studio's deliverables were instrumental to the functioning of his business. He was, in that specific and practical sense, dependent on the quality of my work in the same way that one professional depends on another when the work is necessary and the alternative is not doing it. I charge market rate. He paid it. 7 years is the time the title references, and I want to be clear about what 7 years means in this context. It is not the distance between the christening and the moment he worked for my company. That distance was 4 months to the first conversation and 10 months to the completed project. 7 years is the span of my professional life at the time of the christening, the design school graduation, the agency years, the freelance period, the studio, and it is also the span during which my father had held his assessment of my choices without updating it in any significant way. What Paulette Shire did, in 60 seconds with a clipboard and a professional tone, was introduce into a room full of people a single fact that the 7 years had produced: a receipt, a contract with my name on it, a deposit that had been paid and could be confirmed. I had not arranged for Paulette to be at the right place at the right time. She was there because it was her venue and her event, and mid-event floor checks were part of how she ran her events. I had not told her that a family conflict might arise that would make her records relevant. I had not prepared any moment. I had simply done what I did with most things: made the arrangements, kept the documentation, paid the invoice, and moved on. The documentation had its own staying power. It was in Paulette's file before my father stood up. It was in her file after he sat back down. The receipt was the same receipt at 2:45 and at 3:10. What changed at 3:10 was that someone who held the receipt was in the room and chose to read it aloud. That is not a strategy. It is what happens when you have been doing the work for 7 years, and a room finally contains someone who knows what the work costs. I will be precise about where things stand now because I think precision is more useful than a cleaner ending than the fact support. My father and I speak regularly. Not frequently, but regularly. Once every 2 or 3 weeks, on Sunday mornings, for between 20 and 40 minutes. The conversations are different in register from the conversations we had before the christening. They are more careful, more willing to leave things unresolved. He asks about the studio with a specificity that suggests he has thought about what to ask, which is new. He came to the studio once, about a year after the christening, when we were midway through his project. Oluwatosin gave him a walkthrough of the identity work in progress. I was in another meeting for the first half, and joined them afterward. My father sat in the conference room and looked at the work on the wall with an attention I recognized from the rare occasions in my childhood when he had given me the same attention, total, without the overlay of assessment, simply looking at what was in front of him. He said, "This is good." He was talking about the work. He may have been talking about something else as well. I said thank you, and we moved on to the next item on the agenda. Tobias is now a toddler who walks with the particular confident unsteadiness of a child who has recently discovered that walking is possible and has not yet discovered that it comes with limits. I see him at family gatherings, of which there are now 3 or 4 a year that I attend. The gatherings are different since the christening, not dramatically, not in a way that anyone has named, but differently weighted. I sit at the family table. My father passes the food. My Aunt Blessing asks about the studio. Tobias falls down and gets back up, and nobody discusses the christening, because some things are understood without discussion, and because Tobias has moved on, and we have all, to varying degrees, moved in his direction. Here is what I have come to understand in the years since the Harrow House. The practice of doing the work without announcing it has a cost and a return. The cost is that the work can be invisible for a very long time, long enough for people who love you to build a picture of you that the work directly contradicts. The return is that the work itself does not care whether it has been announced. It exists. It is in files and on invoices and in the memories of people like Paulette Shire, who keep records because records are how they run their operations, and who will read those records aloud in a room if a room asks them to. I am not recommending silence as a strategy. I am describing what I did and what it produced. What I know from the other side of it is that there is a difference between hiding what you have built and simply building it, and that the difference matters mostly to the person doing the building. I was not hiding. I was building. The distinction felt important at the time and feels more important now. My father spent 7 years with a picture of me that was built from the moment I left for design school and was not updated because I had not given him a moment that required him to update it. Paulette Shire gave him that moment without my asking her to, because she keeps her files in order and was in the room when the files became relevant. I did not need her to do it. The receipt was mine whether she read it aloud or not. But I will not pretend that the reading aloud did not matter because it did, not to what I had built, which was already built, but to what my father understood about what I had built, which is a different thing. I want to close with this. And I want to say it plainly rather than as an aphorism because this story is not a lesson about aphorisms. The work you do in private does not become more real when someone witnesses it. But the people who love you become more accurate about who you are. And accuracy, between people who intend to remain in each other's lives, is worth more than most things I can think of. So here is my question for you, and I want you to sit with it before you answer in the comments. If you had been at a table in the Harrow House on that Saturday afternoon in September, one of the 52 people in the room, when Paulette Shire crossed the floor with her clipboard, at what moment did you understand what was about to happen? Was it when she stopped at my father's end of the table? Was it when she said the words, "person of record"? Or was it earlier, before she spoke at all, when you saw her cross the room with the particular pace of a person who already knows what she's going to say? Because I think that pace is recognizable. I think it is the pace of someone who has the documentation and is walking toward the moment that needs it. I'll be back next week. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who has been doing the work without the acknowledgement. And if you've ever paid for something that someone else dismissed, tell me in the comments. I read everything.